This is Western European politics and transatlantic relations, and we are on lecture 7, in which we're going to be talking a little bit about Western Europe and the new Cold War. And this one really follows on from the previous class when we talked about Détente and West Germany's Ostpolitik. So the first slide, by way of an introduction, refers to some of Détente's achievements. So when we think about the period in the 1970s and the major diplomatic accomplishments, there's a brief list here. So 1971, we have the quadripartite agreement over Berlin. This was a four-power agreement, which essentially recognized the status quo. I think I referred to it in passing when we talked a little bit about West Germany's Ostpolitik. Ratification of West Germany's treaty with Moscow, with the Soviet Union in Moscow, so it's commonly referred to as the Moscow Treaty in 1970. Ratification of that was made contingent on the successful negotiation of a four-power agreement over Berlin, which was reached in August 1971. I think it subsequently came into force in 72, and it basically recognized the status quo. It essentially recognized that the four powers were going to remain, that Berlin was going to stay divided. There were one or two sort of ambiguities in all of that, and I'm not going to spend time talking about it now. But that was one of the four. That was one of the major accomplishments. Following year, Richard Nixon famously visits Moscow. During the course of that, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty is signed, SALT I, which basically establishes ceilings on the number of strategic nuclear missiles that the United States and the Soviet Union were allowed to possess. Then following on from that, and this is the thing that I am going to be spending a little chunk of time in this lecture talking about, mainly because I didn't really have time to go into in any great detail in the previous lecture. 1973, we see the opening of the Conference on Security Cooperation in Europe. That is in session for a couple of years, and it culminates with the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975. And I tend to think this is the high watermark of the Détente period. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then 1979, on this list here, we have the second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT II, which was a sort of follow-up from SALT I, but it's signed by President Carter in 1979. 1979 is really the year where the Détente system, if I can put it that way, begins to deteriorate quite markedly. So we're pretty much in the fag end, if you like, of the Détente period by 1979. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Conference of Security Cooperation in Europe. If you're interested in this subject, there is one article on the reading list which I can thoroughly recommend. I forget the full name of the author, but her second name is Romano. And the article is entitled something along the lines, I don't have it in front of me, but something along the lines of Détente, Entente, on linkage. And I think it does a really interesting, it's a really interesting discussion, if you like, on American policy on the conference vis-a-vis Moscow, but also in relation to America's relations with its European allies and some of the sort of transatlantic differences that sort of emerge in terms of the conference. Okay, before I kind of knock off the various points on the slide here, let's just have a quick description of what the actual conference was. Conference itself, well, first thing to say is that the Soviets have been demanding a conference for many years, and essentially what the Soviets were looking for was a recognition of as Timothy Garton Ash puts it, they wanted recognition of Yalta Europe. That is to say, the European structures that emerge after the Second World War, and principally, I suppose, they want a sort of de facto recognition of the division between East and West, and especially the permanence of Europe's post-1945 frontiers. So the Soviets had for a long time been demanding some sort of European security conference. Towards the end of the 1960s, though, they get some sort of traction on this issue, not least because the West Germans, as part of their Ostpolitik, the West Germans say that they would be willing to support such a conference in return for the Soviets engaging with them constructively on the issue of engaging with them when it came to Ostpolitik. So the conference was one of the carrots, essentially, that the West Germans sort of dangle in front of the Soviets. Should also be said, late 60s, again, we've spoken about this in a previous class, NATO begins to reform itself. You have the so-called Harmel Report at the end of the 1960s, which talks about the possibility of NATO having a stronger political role and essentially advocating sort of detente policies. So by the early 70s, Western Europe is certainly becoming more amenable to the idea of a European Security Conference. The United States, though, especially under Nixon, was pretty ambivalent about the conference. Essentially, the Nixon administration viewed the conference as a concession, which they might make into the Soviets in return for other concessions from the Soviets elsewhere. So they essentially see the conference as a bargaining chip, something that they can put on the table in the hope, as I say, of winning other concessions from the Soviets. So as I say, the Americans never really, certainly under Nixon, never entirely, never entirely embracing the idea of a conference. And in this sense, you can see a little bit of a, what's the word? I don't know, a mismatch, I suppose, between European views, Western European views about the desirability of a conference and that of the United States. I think it's fair to say most European governments, but especially West Germany, to some extent France, were more enthusiastic about the idea of a European conference than the United States. As I say, the conference opens in 1973, and it basically involves the whole of Europe. So virtually every European state is present. The only exception is Albania, which chooses to sit out the conference. I don't think they were particularly missed. Plus North America in the shape of Canada and the United States. Initially, the Soviet proposal is for a purely European conference. Eventually, though, they agree to the presence of the United States and Canada. Europeans basically say if you want a conference, you're going to have to include, let's say, North America as well. And as I say, it's convened in 73 and it culminates in the Helsinki Final Act. Now, in terms of the Act itself, if you do a quick Google search, you can find the actual text of the Act. One thing I'd say, it's quite long and pretty technical. But the Act which finally emerges, and Romana goes into the sort of toings and froings in terms of the diplomacy. Essentially, as I say, the Americans are somewhat ambivalent about the conference to begin with, view it as a bargaining chip. By 1974-75, both the Soviets and the Americans sort of want the conference to be concluded quite quickly. As I say, the Americans never really embraced the idea. To them, conference is always somewhat cosmetic. However, the Europeans are, to some extent, are the negotiators who are pushing for a more substantive treaty to emerge from the conference. So Romano basically suggests that there is some sort of entente emerges between the Soviets and the Americans over the conference, and to some extent they're sort of pushing back against the Europeans. Eventually, though, the Helsinki Final Act is ultimately sort of emerges and is divided into 3 separate sections, which for some reason were referred to as baskets. So you have basket 1, basket 2, and basket 3, which is what I say on the second slide here. I'll go back to the previous slide in a moment. Basket 1, the first section, basically deals with issues relating to frontiers and sovereignty. And it basically states quite explicitly that Europe's frontiers are inviolable and can only be changed peacefully. Again, the language is very similar to the language that is used in the various treaties that West Germany signs with various communist states. Again, this word inviolable appears, this idea. Not permanent, not fixed, but nonetheless, this recognition that the frontiers in Europe are more or less here to stay. And this, I suppose, is the principal thing that the Soviets want from the conference. So to some extent, it's a sort of concession which is made to the Soviets. Basket 2 relates to trade, technological transfers, and scientific exchange. Again, this is something that the Soviets want. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy was beginning to run into difficulties. They wanted access to Western technology, Western money in terms of credits, finance, that sort of stuff. So again, it should be said trade anyway was a reasonably significant element within the sort of detente process. So yeah, the Soviets are looking for that as well. The most controversial section, and the one that the Western Europeans were really pressing for, and as I say, Nixon and Kissinger initially quite ambivalent. Eventually they come round, especially after Nixon's out of the way, but after 1974, the Americans come round to this. The Western Europeans insist that the Soviets have to recognize certain fundamental human rights. Things like the freedom to worship. They also demanded for greater access for Western reporters in the Eastern Bloc. So this is the sort of quid pro quo that the Western Europeans are demanding. They're essentially saying, okay, we'll give you baskets 1 and 2, but in return you want basket 3. I think the Americans less concerned about basket 3. As I say, Nixon and Kissinger are realists. They're not, they're not overly concerned about things like human rights. In their eyes, the whole conference is just, as I say, a bargaining chip for, in return for greater things elsewhere. This is this idea of linkage as well. We'll give you the conference, but we will link success in the conference to sort of concessions elsewhere. But as I said, the Europeans insist on basket 3, and they get it. And I mentioned these sort of competing objectives on the previous slide. So as we say, USSR wants acceptance of the alter Europe. They wanted the trade and technological transfers, but yeah, as I say, the West basically wanted to protect certain fundamental human rights, which were included in basket 3. Why did the Soviets agree to this then? Well, first and foremost, as I say, the Soviets think that they're going to need to realize they're going to have to make some kind of concession to the Europeans in return for baskets 1 and 2. So it's a necessary concession. But more particularly, they think the language in basket 3 is pretty ambiguous and ultimately unenforceable. So in a sense, the Soviet leaders simply think, okay, we can sort of, we can sign this, but ultimately, when it comes to it, there's no way that this can sort of be forced upon us. Ultimately, they think this is a fairly sort of empty concession that they are actually making. Furthermore, basket 1 also contains a sort of classical statement of state sovereignty, this idea that outside actors, external states, could not interfere in the internal affairs of another state. So the Soviets can always say, you know, if Western states start objecting to what was happening inside the Soviet bloc, they can always say, well, actually, it's none of your business. We're a sovereign state. We can do what we want. And Basket 1 basically says this. Should be said, you know, the Soviet perception of Basket 3 is also shared by quite a few politicians in America and Europe, particularly those on the right. So two, at this point, fairly marginal figures, one being Ronald Reagan, who I think at this point is governor of California. Another is Margaret Thatcher, who's a sort of rising star in the Conservative Party. And I think by 75, she's actually become leader of the Conservative Party, but still in opposition. Both of them are very, very critical of Helsinki. And as I say, they essentially share the Soviet view that these are fairly sort of empty statements. So they come to be quite critical of the whole conference and the Helsinki process, which is what I say on the next slide. It seems to sort of confirm the status quo. As I say, the Soviets don't take the human rights provisions particularly seriously. There's a follow-up conference as well in Belgrade in 1977, in which the sort of divisions between East and West can be seen. And the other point I would make about the whole Helsinki is that the language is actually quite ambiguous, which goes back to the point I made earlier. Timothy Garton Ash makes this point. You know, he says, was there one Helsinki Final Act, or actually several? In the sense that the act could be interpreted in a number of different ways. So the Soviets have their own version of Helsinki, and the West have their version, and ultimately, you know, these two visions begin to sort of clash quite fundamentally, which perhaps is partly, well, I would argue actually, is a sort of reflection of why the detente process in general begins to deteriorate quite markedly. Basically, you know, the United States and the West in general have their vision of detente, the Soviets have their own vision, and ultimately the two views, as I say, sort of clash against each other and ultimately prove irreconcilable. One final point I'll make about Helsinki, and again, plenty of historians and writers have made this point, is that the Soviets signed the human rights provisions thinking that this is a fairly sort of empty concession that they are making. Ultimately, which is what I say here, they come to be something of a ticking bomb for a variety of reasons. Ticking bomb meaning that ultimately, you know, a bomb ticking away, which eventually, after a period of time, sort of explodes. And you could argue this is essentially what happens with Helsinki. You know, plenty of historians have suggested that actually the conference and the Helsinki Final Act become a major contributory factor to the ending of the Cold War at the end of the 1980s. Why is that so? A couple of reasons. First of all, although Thatcher and Reagan are very critical of Helsinki, ultimately they prove very adept at using the Helsinki Final Act and the commitment that the Soviets have made to respecting certain fundamental human rights. They are very adept at using that as a weapon with which to beat the Soviets. Furthermore, various opposition groups in Eastern Europe also seize on Helsinki and essentially use Helsinki as a way of further delegitimizing and undermining the Soviet empire from within. So again, it's no accident, well, I say it's no accident, but there's almost certainly some sort of relationship between the signing of the Act in the mid-70s and the emergence, as I say, of various opposition groups in Eastern Europe in the late 70s. So you have Solidarity in Poland, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. And again, they too seize upon Helsinki as a way of sort of undermining, delegitimizing Soviet rule, essentially saying to the Soviet Union and the various communist governments, which had obviously also signed the Helsinki Final Act, saying, you have promised to respect these certain rights, you're not doing so. So as I say, it becomes quite a significant factor in undermining Soviet rule, the communist bloc, if you like, in Eastern Europe in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, why did Détente unravel? Well, I've alluded to one factor already. But yeah, the slide here indicates several others as well. First of all, Détente as a product of Nixon and Kissinger's policies. Yeah, I think Nixon and Kissinger have a very particular view of détente. Essentially, you could argue détente almost becomes sort of containment by other means. So they view détente as a way of essentially persuading the Soviets to behave in a more predictable and stable manner. One analogy, I can't remember if I mentioned this in the previous class, but one analogy that's often made in terms of describing the American view of détente is that the Soviet Union was a sort of recalcitrant donkey that needed to be basically managed through a series of carrots and sticks. So if the donkey misbehaves, you beat it with a stick. In other words, you impose sanctions or try and punish it in some way. On the other hand, you try and reward the donkey for good behavior or persuade the donkey to behave in a manner in which you want by dangling various carrots in front of it. So this is the Nixon and Kissinger approach to policy. As I say, they view détente as a means of trying, as I say, of essentially trying to stabilize the Cold War. The problem, of course, though, is by the end of 74, Nixon is out of the picture. He's had to resign in disgrace. Kissinger carries on as Secretary of State under President Ford, but then Ford himself loses the election in 76, and then Jimmy Carter, and we'll talk about Carter in a moment, but essentially, the two great architects of détente in the early and mid-70s, they are off the political scene by the beginning of 1977, which I think is significant. Secondly, no agreement between the superpowers over what détente actually was. As I say, the Nixon-Kissinger conception of détente is that the Soviets are a sort of donkey which has to be sort of prodded and whatever. Strangely enough, the Soviets do not view themselves as a donkey. For the Soviets, it's basically a sort of détente is a recognition of parity. That they see the détente as the United States finally acknowledging that the Soviet Union is a superpower with the same kind of status, if you like. And essentially, for them, it's not. The Cold War, from the Soviet perspective, the Cold War hasn't actually fundamentally changed. There's still going to be superpower competition in various parts of the world and all the rest of it. So I think there is a sort of mismatch between the American vision of détente and the Soviet vision of détente, which is sort of papered over in the early to mid-70s. But increasingly, these sort of rival visions sort of clash, notably when it comes to Soviet behavior in the developing world. I think this is where détente really starts to unravel. From the American perspective, you want stability, and Soviet activities, fomenting revolutions or sending in soldiers into various states or whatever, that is fundamentally destabilizing. As I say, from the Soviets, though, it's simply business as usual. As I say, there's a fundamental, difference in their sort of competing views about what détente is and what it actually entails. So both superpowers viewed détente as the Cold War by other means, but as I say, for the Americans, it's containment. For the Soviets, it's simply, as I say, sort of recognition. Soviet activities in Africa, particularly in Angola, Cuba sends troops into Angola, into the conflict there in the 1970s. Cuba effectively acting as a Soviet proxy. Then you've got Soviet influence and again Soviet activities on the Horn of Africa. That also, Horn of Africa meaning that part of Africa which includes Ethiopia, Somalia, those sorts of places. Again, that creates friction. And then finally, and we will get to this, you have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, which in some ways is the sort of last nail in Détente's coffin. One final point I'll make very quickly. Nixon oversold Détente. I mean, Nixon basically says, he comes into office promising an era of negotiations and essentially saying he would sort of negotiate away the Cold War. And some historians have tried to make the argument that to some extent he's to some extent he's successful in the sense that the Cold War does sort of come to an end in the mid 1970s and then restarts again. Sometimes historians talk about a second Cold War or a new Cold War, late 1970s into the 1980s. I think that's an exaggeration. Obviously, the Cold War doesn't come to an end. That superpower competition does continue through the 1970s. And when it becomes apparent that the Cold War hasn't ended, I think a sense of disillusion begins to set in. Certainly there's a feeling, similar, I would say, to the late 1940s. Certainly, I think a feeling begins to set in American political circles that the Soviets are sort of being dishonest. They're fundamentally sort of reneging on the previous commitments that they had made. Okay, as I said earlier, 1977, Carter comes into office. He wins the 1976 presidential election against Ford. Carter's main selling point, I suppose, is that he wasn't Nixon. He was a very different type of politician from Nixon. 1976, 77, a pretty grim year for the United States, mainly because of the sort of political scandal surrounding Watergate, which had led to Nixon resigning in disgrace, the first time in American history a president had resigned from office. You also, of course, have the end of the Vietnam War, which again is seen as a sort of national humiliation. So Carter comes in promising a fresh start. As you can see from the picture there, he has a very sort of cheesy grin on his face. But Carter, he's a Democrat, he's a liberal, and fundamentally, he comes in wanting to continue with détente policies, but ultimately he's the president which sort of presides over the collapse of détente. Now, I think it's fair to say that Carter has not gone down in history as... Sorry, my slides are going slightly haywire here. Carter has not gone down in history as one of the great American presidents, and especially in terms of his foreign policy. I actually think, to some extent, Carter... his reputation is perhaps, let's say he is unfairly maligned, I think, in some quarters. Actually, I don't think his foreign policy was anything like as bad as some people viewed it as being at the time. He does have the misfortune, though, of coming into office at a particular turbulent period in international history. You can make sort of parallels with what's happening with now. I mean, you have the oil shocks in the 1970s, the American economy running into difficulties, as well as a series of international crises, and in combination, all these things ultimately, kill his presidency. So Carter only has one term in office, which again is quite unusual. Most American presidents usually manage to win a second term. It's quite possible that Trump will, although, as I say, possibly he might experience a similar fate to Carter, given, the economic situation and the way that the virus has been handled and all the rest of it. But anyway, that's going slightly off topic. So Carter, a one-term president, as I say, he has a fairly sort of grim reputation, although I think historians have sort of begun to sort of reappraise Carter's presidency and his foreign policy. He comes in, though, and one of the major words associated with Carter's national security strategy is trilateralism, in the sense that Carter comes in and he wants to renew America's relations with its chief allies, meaning the Europeans and Japan. So he has a sort of triangular conception of, of a sort of partnership between America and its main allies. So Europe and Japan, which again is something of a contrast to Nixon, who I think it's fair to say from the outset is pretty dismissive of America's European allies. Carter comes in, also places human rights right at the center of his foreign policy, promises that human rights will be a sort of major influence in terms of how he manages his relations. Again, he's sort of coming off the back of the Helsinki Final Act, and Carter also uses Helsinki as a way of putting pressure on the communist bloc. As I say, you have this follow-up Helsinki conference in '77, which is during Carter's presidency, in which these sort of issues begin to come to an head. He does attain a number of foreign policy successes. I would say probably his most significant achievement is the Camp David Accords, which was in which the Americans basically broker a peace between Israel and Egypt. He also signs a treaty with Panama, effectively bringing an end to America's sort of possession of the Panama Canal, which at the time was quite a tricky political maneuver, which he manages to pull off quite successfully. However, these successes are overshadowed, as I say on the final point, by several prominent foreign policy failures. Most notably, and I think this is the single biggest thing that really kills his presidency, you have the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which in itself is a sort of calamitous foreign policy setback. Iran, until '79, had been a very close American ally, obviously a very important regional player in the Middle East. Suddenly, overnight, it goes to being a very kind of hostile state, when Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian revolutionaries take over. And in the wake of that, you have a hostage crisis. The American embassy is seized in Tehran. A number of diplomats are taken hostage, and it leads to a very protracted crisis, for a very protracted American foreign policy crisis. Carter fails to get the hostages out. He does authorize a rescue mission, which goes horribly wrong. And the hostages aren't released until Carter leaves office. I think it's literally on the first day of Reagan's presidency that they are actually released. So you have Iran. You also have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which, as I say, in some ways is the last nail in Détente's coffin. Okay, let's bring the Europeans back into the picture. European views of Carter, as I say, initially quite favourable. In the sense that, it's clear that Carter was taking European concerns reasonably seriously. Carter makes it clear to the Europeans that he was keen to hear what they had to say, that he, that he was negotiating with them or talking to them on a serious basis. As I say, but that in itself is a sort of marked attitude from the sort of Nixon administration. Then the second point there, Carter also establishes quite good relations with several European leaders, especially the British Prime Minister in the late 70s, Jim Callaghan. President Giscard of France also, had a reasonably good working relationship. The exception, though, the fly in the ointment, if you like, is Helmut Schmidt, the West German leader. He's a guy who comes after Willy Brandt, after Brandt resigns. I think Brandt resigns in '74, if I remember correctly. Schmidt takes over, and it's fair to say relations between Schmidt and Carter were not good. In fact, when Schmidt writes his memoirs after he retires, he devotes a whole chapter in his memoirs to talking about Carter and basically, saying Carter was an idiot. Relations between Schmidt and Carter were never good. which is obviously is a problem for a variety of reasons. One I'll talk about in a moment. So yeah, as I say, reasonably positive working relationship. The third point, though, where I say here, Europeans later become concerned about Carter's approach towards the Soviets. One thing you get a sense with the Europeans during the Cold War is that they can never quite decide what sort of American president that they want. Do they want a hawk, somebody who's going to take a tough line with the Soviets, or do they want somebody to be more flexible? So, having been, fairly critical of Nixon, who was pretty tough, Carter comes in preaching the virtues of detente, emphasizing the importance of human rights, and the European feeling is that perhaps Carter is a bit too limp-wristed, a bit too liberal in his approach. Europeans also rather skeptical about the emphasis that Carter places on human rights. I think it's fair to say many European governments had a rather more realist conception of international relations, and they felt that human rights was something of a distraction. Then you have the so-called neutron bomb incident. The neutron bomb was labelled as being the ultimate capitalist weapon because it killed people, but it didn't destroy property. It basically emitted a lot of radiation. And was very controversial, but the Americans wanted to deploy the bomb in Europe, which various European governments, including West Germany, reluctantly agreed to this. They realized that public opinion isn't going to be too happy, but after some American pressure, they kind of agreed to it. And then at the last moment, Carter decides against it. He sort of reverses his opinion and says, actually, we're not going to deploy this weapon. And certainly Schmidt was none too happy about this, simply because he'd taken a sort of political risk at the request of the Americans. And then, as I say, at the last moment, Carter says, no, I'm not going to do this after all. Which, as I say, Schmidt was none too happy about. So in general, as I say, the relationship between the Europeans and the Americans, I mean, a reasonably good working relationship. Although, as I say, Schmidt was perhaps the exception here. You also have the fact, late 70s, the Cold War again begins to intensify for several reasons. One of which is that the Soviets decide to deploy a new intermediate nuclear missile into Eastern Europe. Intermediate meaning it was sort of medium range missile, and that basically it could be fired from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and that it would hit European targets, Western European targets. So the deployment of the SS-20 made the Western Europeans sort of feel more vulnerable, which in some ways was sort of kind of counterproductive. I remember asking Professor John Lewis Gaddis, he once visited my old university. I remember once asking him about this, about why did the Soviets do this? Right in the middle of the detente, especially at a time when they're trying to sort of detach the Europeans or drive a wedge between the Europeans and the United States. Why did they deploy this missile in a way that, as I say, basically heightens Western European insecurity? And his answer was that basically the Soviets just did not have a very kind of clear strategy. And it was in some way a sort of reflection of the Soviet political system that, Brezhnev or whoever, Kosygin, could sort of make decisions on a whim. And there was nobody there really to kind of check them or say, hang on a minute, Mr. Chairman, are you making is this necessarily the correct decision here? Anyway, the Soviets deployed this missile, and I think one consequence of that is that it sort of pushes the Europeans back into the American camp, or strengthen. Maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. Not so much back into the American camp, because I don't think they ever left it. But it sort of strengthens the ties between the Europeans and the Americans. Not least, I think, the Europeans suddenly rediscover the virtue of NATO. So NATO, which, late 60s, early 70s, was undergoing a sort of mini crisis, I think. Some people questioning whether the organization was really necessary in the detente period. With the Soviet Union, again, seeming to be more threatening. as I say, the Western Europeans suddenly rediscover the virtues of NATO. And NATO itself, as I say, third point there, opts for a dual track strategy. Essentially, they decide that they will pursue negotiations with the Soviets in an effort to persuade Moscow to withdraw the missile from Eastern Europe. But while they're doing that, NATO would actually develop and then deploy their own medium-range missiles in Western Europe. So if they failed to actually, if they failed to persuade the Soviets, then NATO would actually, as I say, deploy their own version of medium-range missiles in Europe. These were kind of cruise and Pershing missiles. Again, I mean, I'm sort of entering into the period of my lifetime now. I mean, I was born in the mid-70s, and have vague recollections, vague memories of the late 70s, early 80s. And the nuclear missile issue was certainly something that was in the news in that period. The American deployment of medium-range missiles, this was quite a controversial step. There were plenty of people in Europe who, I'm talking now not governments necessarily, but in terms of sort of public opinion, there were plenty of people in Europe, certainly in Britain. I remember the protests. I remember seeing news clips of the protests and stuff like that quite clearly. Other countries as well, West Germany. We'll talk a little bit about Germany and the nuclear issue in a moment. But Carter, as I say, promises that there will be the deployment of these missiles to counter the Soviet deployment of the SS-20. Carter then also begins to increase the American defense budget in the late 70s. Again, that's worth noting because often people tend to think it's Reagan who starts the process of American rearmament. That is not true. Carter had already started to significantly increase American military expenditure even before Reagan comes in and sort of intensifies the arms race in the early 80s between the Soviets and the United States. Europeans also promised to increase their defense expenditure as well. Again, we're back to the sort of point of the Europeans rediscovering NATO. The peace movement, which I alluded to, the protests against nuclear weapons. It's really the late 70s that this begins to become a significant force in European politics, especially on the European left. And as I say, this is especially true in Germany, in West Germany, where the Social Democratic Party ultimately splits on the issue of nuclear weapons. Schmidt, who in the party was, I suppose, a fairly conservative figure, was sort of supportive of the American deployment, but there were plenty of others in the party who were opposed. And as I say, the government basically collapses in 1982. The West German government collapses in 1982 on whether or not it should support the deployment of intermediate nuclear forces. Again, these are the sort of medium-range missiles I was talking about. And a Christian Democratic government is cobbled together under Helmut Kohl, who then goes on to win, I think, if I'm getting my political history correct here, I think he wins an election in 1983, beginning Kohl's tenure. And Kohl was Chancellor of Germany for a long time. Again, he's the first German Chancellor I really remember. But he's in office from, I think, 82 to 1998. So good, about 16 years. The British Labour Party, which in the early 80s as well was pretty left-wing, and I think after the 1983 election, the Labour Party commits itself to a policy of unilateralism, which basically meant that Britain would unilaterally scrap its nuclear deterrent. So the British Labour Party, like their counterparts in West Germany, were also taking a decidedly anti-nuclear stand. In the case of Labour, though, Labour are out of government. Labour loses the 1979 election. So in the 1980s, they are in opposition. But they are, as I say, they are promising that a Labour government, were they to come back to power, pursue this sort of unilateralist policy. LSA, NATO experiences something of a revival in this period. Late 70s, second point there, Europe and the US agreed to modernize NATO. And between them, the United States and Europe also agreed to increase their defense expenditure by about 3% a year. As I say, Carter had already begun this process with 5% increases in the American defense budget. And the United States also deploys an additional 35,000 troops in Europe. So again, an indication, late 70s, that the Cold War is again beginning to intensify, that the detente period is starting to come to an end. As I said, detente basically ends late 70s, partly, as I mentioned earlier, it's because of Soviet activities in the Third World, in Angola, Ethiopia, the Iranian Revolution, which I mentioned a moment earlier. Also, it's not Cold War in the sense that the Iranian government that comes to power is not a communist government. Far from it. It's a radical Islamic government. But nonetheless, as I say, until 1979, Iran had been a very close ally of the United States, a very important regional player in the Middle East. And so, the fact that it suddenly slips out of America's grasp, as it were, that's seen as a massive setback for the United States. And then, of course, you have the hostage crisis. Then December 1979, Christmas Day, I think, 79, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. And as I say, that in many ways is the last nail in Détente's coffin. Again, I don't think we need to go into too much detail as to why they do that. But essentially, the Soviets are trying to prop up a communist government, which had briefly come to power in Afghanistan. They march in. Afghanistan ultimately becomes the Soviet Union's own version of Vietnam, their own, as I say, their own sort of Vietnam in terms of being a sort of foreign policy problem, a drain on Soviet resources. You might have seen the film Charlie Wilson's War, starring Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts, which portrays some of the activities that the United States, covert activities that the United States sort of embarked upon in this period. And again, I think we're sort of back to the sort of competing perceptions of detente. For the Soviets, as I say, Afghanistan is sort of business as usual, a reassertion of the Brezhnev doctrine, that is, as I say, intervening to prop up the communist government. From the American perspective, though, this is, first of all, it's seen as a major act of Soviet aggression, and secondly, it's seen as a sort of betrayal. It's seen as the Soviets taking action that fundamentally runs counter to the spirit of detente. I've seen one or two published documents in the American series, Foreign Relations in the United States, and you can see in the sort of exchanges between Carter and Brezhnev and other American and Soviet officials that there is this sort of fundamental misunderstanding or misperception of what is actually happening here. The two sides have very different views of what is happening and what is going on. US responds by imposing sanctions, economic sanctions on the Soviet Union. Also, the Americans decide that they are going to boycott the Moscow Olympics. 4 years later, the Soviets do the same with the Olympics in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Olympics are the first ones I can really remember. Leading to probably two of the most boring sporting events ever, or at least in terms of the Olympic athletics contests. US covertly begins to supply weapons to the Mujahideen. These are the Islamic rebels fighting Soviet forces, and again, Charlie Wilson's War portrays some of these sort of activities. And then Carter unveils a new presidential doctrine. He says that the United States would oppose any Soviet move into the Persian Gulf. Effectively, making it clear that the United States and the Soviet Union are at loggerheads. Looking at the European response, well, by 79, Margaret Thatcher has become Prime Minister of Britain. We'll talk a little bit more about her in a moment. But she's a conservative, an instinctive Atlanticist. I think it's fair to say, having read her memoirs a long, long time ago, but I think it's fair to say that she was not somebody who had a particularly high opinion of President Carter, but nonetheless, Britain comes out and adopts a pretty supportive position of the United States. France and Germany, though, are rather more ambivalent. They issue a statement saying that another crisis of this kind would kill detente. The implication being that Afghanistan in and of itself had not killed detente, that it would take yet another crisis. Germany especially, I think, still remains committed to its Ostpolitik. So, the Germans are reluctant to see Germans are reluctant to see detente derailed. Sorry, I was just looking because I thought I might have a quotation from Schmidt on this slide, but I don't. But Schmidt basically says something along the lines, we're not going to allow however many years of detente and Ostpolitik to be derailed by Afghanistan. France also maintains its contacts with the Soviet Union. In general, as I say, the Europeans much less willing to see detente founder over Afghanistan. From the European perspective, Afghanistan is a sideshow. It does not really affect fundamental European interests in any way. So again, there's something of a sort of mismatch between the American response to Afghanistan and the European response. I think Congress is, I think it might be the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Again, I don't have the quotation on this side, but they say something along the lines that the reactions of the Europeans have been found wanting. Again, a reflection of the fact that there was some division. Okay. And then in the early 80s, you do see a change in Europe's political leadership. I've just mentioned Mrs. Thatcher. As I say, she becomes leader of the Conservative Party in the mid-1970s, and she is part of what becomes referred to as the New Right, so a new generation of quite right-wing leaders in North America and Europe. She comes into office in the spring of 1979, so she becomes Prime Minister around that time. I think it's fair to say that opinion about Thatcher to this day is pretty divided in the UK. I remember a few years ago when she died, the country was pretty split between those who thought she was brilliant and fabulous and great leader and all the rest of it, and those who basically hated her guts. So her premiership was really controversial. It was controversial in a number of respects, not least in terms of her economic policies, which were extremely radical. She basically embraces the ideas of Milton Friedman, pursued a very tight monetary policy in the early 80s, deregulated the British economy, basically pursued policies which I suppose today we would refer as neoliberalism. And her supporters say she sort of revived the British economy, got it running. But Britain does experience a very sharp period of deindustrialization in the early 1980s. Unemployment rises almost to 3 million in 1982-83. For a time, it looks like she might actually lose the election. But she goes on to fight quite a nasty little war in the South Atlantic with Argentina, the Falklands War, which to a large extent sort of secures her re-election in 1983, and then she's there for about just over 10 years. She sort of resigns in 1990. In terms of her foreign policy, though, as I mentioned earlier, she is a committed supporter of the British relationship with the United States, the special relationship with the United States. And relations become particularly warm after Ronald Reagan, who in many ways is a sort of ideological soulmate of Thatcher. So the UK-US relationship becomes particularly warm after he becomes president at the beginning of 1981. Then you had the guy in the middle, this being Francois Mitterrand, who is president of France from 1981 to 1995. I should say each of these leaders were in office for a long time. Thatcher the shortest, being a mere, as I say, 10. About 11 years actually. Now I think about it, yeah, she was in office about for about 11 years, 79 to 1990. Mitterrand, though, he had 2 terms as French president. Back then, the French presidency lasted 7 years, so he was 14 years, so 81 to 95. And there's a sort of curiosity in French politics that those on the left tend to be more supportive of the United States than those on the right. So if you think back to de Gaulle, which we already talked in some detail about de Gaulle, de Gaulle, a conservative, but somebody who wanted to sort of loosen France's connections with the United States. Mitterrand, who was one of de Gaulle's main political opponents, but doesn't become French president until the beginning of the 1980s. Mitterrand, although on the left, in some ways had a more kind of comfortable working relationship with the United States. And unlike, many other socialist parties in Europe, the French left were not particularly anti-nuclear. In fact, France had its own nuclear weapons. In fact, French energy relied quite heavily on nuclear power. So unlike in Germany and Britain, the French socialists don't strike a particularly anti-nuclear posture. And then the third figure is, as I say, is Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany. As I say, I think he comes into office in 1982, and he's there until 1998. So, as I say, almost 16 years as Chancellor. And yeah, he's a Christian Democrat, and the Christian Democrats in Germany were, reasonably accepting of the American deployment of intermediate-range nuclear weapons. One point Garton Ash makes, though, is that the Christian Democrats kind of continue with the Ostpolitik policies of their social democratic predecessors. So although Kohl is sort of an Atlanticist, he certainly doesn't sever West Germany's contacts with the Eastern Bloc. So Ostpolitik, perhaps at a slightly less ostentatious level than had been the case in the 1970s, but Ostpolitik certainly doesn't come to an end with Kohl's arrival in power. Okay, sorry, I think I've got each of the 3 leaders there. I've kind of repeated, I've already said this, so I'm not going to reiterate this again. But yeah, she becomes conservative leader, so I'm not quite sure why my slides are going backwards for some reason. But yeah, the Falklands War. Yeah, Pravda, though, certainly gives her, does her a huge favour by christening her the Iron Lady in one of its publications in the late 70s, and I think it's fair to say she sort of embraces that particular sobriquet. Francois Mitterrand, as I say, by French standards, an Atlanticist. But yeah, I mean, one thing that we now know certainly is that there are quite close contacts between the French military and US military. I think there's an element of nuclear cooperation as well. Although the French independent is sort of notionally independent of the United States, nonetheless, there was some sort of covert American support for France's nuclear program. Helmut Kohl, as I mentioned, Christian Democrat, comes into power. One thing I forgot to mention when I talked about Kohl is that, Mitterrand and Kohl maintain a very close partnership. Again, I was sort of growing up in the 1980s. I mean, I remember a lot of talk in the 1980s about the Franco-German axis in Europe, this idea that, between France and Britain, sort of dominated the European community. Thatcher's relationship with Kohl, pretty strained. I think it's fair to say Thatcher never entirely trusted the Germans, and we'll certainly talk a little bit more about that when we get on to discussing German unification in a couple of in a couple of days' time. Generally, though, European politics, as I say, that becomes more complex in the 1980s. Several alternative parties, if I can put it that way, begin to emerge, especially the rise of green parties, notably in German politics, to some extent in Scandinavia as well. Not so much the case in other parts of Europe. It's also apparent late 70s, early 80s, this is the period where the period of consensus politics begins to break down. So an ideological division begins to emerge between left and right. As I say, the new right, people like Thatcher come in and who begin to pursue some fairly sort of radical policies. In some countries, this again is quite apparent in Britain, the socialist parties tend to move further to the left. So an ideological division, if you like, begins to reappear between left and right. Then, as I mentioned earlier, you've got the peace movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament. They are pretty active in European politics. So in general, I think you can say, there was an ideological division. In general, European politics seem to sort of shift further to the right. Obviously, you have Thatcher in Britain, Kohl in Germany, Mitterrand, who is a socialist, is president of France, but even he has to cohabit on a couple of occasions with conservative governments led by Jacques Chirac, who of course would later become president of France himself after 1995. Transatlantic relations. Reagan. I'll go into more detail about Reagan when we get on to the next lecture, talking about the end of the Cold War, but he obviously becomes president in 1981, fiercely anti-communist. One of the phrases he's most remembered for is the evil empire. This is how he refers to the Soviet Union. The actual term is used, I think, in a speech which Reagan gives to a group of evangelical Christians. So, I think the context for that is quite important. But he does certainly kind of depict the Cold War in this sort of moralistic, even Manichaean terms. Under Reagan, the US rearmament program is accelerated. As I say, it begins with Carter, but Reagan comes in and basically dramatically increases America's defense budget. Reagan more than happy to splurge billions and billions of dollars on defense. In an effort, basically Reagan says that the United States, if they are going to talk to the Soviets, they need to do so from a position of strength. So Reagan, as I say, embraces American rearmament. And what you see at the early 80s is an arms race beginning to take off between the United States and the Soviet Union, although later, I think Reagan says this to a group of journalists or newspaper editors, so there is an arms race, but only one side is racing. In other words, essentially saying the Soviets can't possibly keep up with us. A renewed emphasis on nuclear weapons. So whereas in the Détente period, there was this idea of parity between the two sides, Reagan comes in and says, no, I'm not interested in parity. I want to, as I say, speak to the Soviets from a position of superiority. And as a consequence of, one other thing I should mention is that Reagan also has this particular pet project, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which gets dubbed Star Wars. And this was the idea that there was going to be a missile shield. And it was going to be very sort of spectacular, very technological. It involved lasers bouncing off satellites and shooting down incoming Soviet strategic missiles. Reagan embraces this, and again, he pours billions and billions of dollars into this. Which really rattles the Soviets. The Soviets hated Star Wars. Pick up any issue of Pravda pretty much in the early 80s, and almost invariably there was going to be a reference to Star Wars. The other thing to say about Reagan and the Reagan administration is that the language they use is also pretty aggressive towards the Soviet Union. And, there's a lot of discussion about the possibility of winning a nuclear war against the Soviet Union and things like that. So all this basically results in a significant deterioration in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the idea of a new or second Cold War begins to kind of re-emerge. And there are several quite significant crises in the early 80s, which kind of reflect the fact that relations between the Soviets and the Americans seem to be going from bad to worse. In particular, a couple of incidents worth mentioning. 1983, the Soviets shoot down a Korean airliner which had accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. The Americans basically accused the Soviets of committing an act of murder. I think we now know that this was a genuine accident, but it did little to sort of improve the situation. Again, I think I dimly remember this, actually. Again, I would have been about 8 at the time. Then Operation Able Archer, 1983, which was a NATO exercise in which NATO was designed to simulate how they would respond to a Soviet nuclear attack. This was significant because by 1983, the leadership in the Soviet Union had come to believe that the United States might actually be preparing a first strike against the Soviet Union, that they might actually launch a nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. And the Soviets half expected that Able Archer was the sort of beginning of an American nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. So it's kind of a reflection of just how far relations have deteriorated, that the Soviet leadership by 1983 seemed to have genuinely believed that the Reagan administration was preparing to launch a nuclear war against them. The other point I would say there is that the Europeans themselves were also beginning to be quite alarmed by the Reagan administration, and again, particularly the language and the rhetoric that surrounded nuclear weapons. There's a general sort of feeling among the Europeans. I should say, I think it was probably my concluding point that European reactions to Reagan somewhat divided. I mentioned Thatcher, who enjoyed a very kind of warm and close working relationship with Reagan. Other Europeans also, Reagan in some ways was quite an attractive personality. He was somebody who it was quite easy to warm to. And the fact that Reagan, as I say, was prepared to pump billions and billions of dollars into the American defense budget, that also served to ease one underlying area of concern between the Americans and the Europeans, in that the issue of burden sharing, something that, an issue which had plagued the transatlantic relationship in the 60s and 70s, that basically disappears in the 1980s, simply because Reagan is happy to spend billions of dollars on defense, regardless of what the Europeans are doing. So the Reagan administration is not putting much in the way of pressure on the Europeans to increase their defense budgets. As I say, Reagan is more than happy to spend this money himself without demanding much in return from the Europeans. However, as I say, the sort of aggressive rhetoric, the emphasis on nuclear superiority, the idea of potentially winning a nuclear war, all this is stuff that sort of does alarm many Europeans. Which does, as I say, create some sort of friction. There's one or two other problems as well in the sort of European-American relationship. 1983, for example, the Reagan administration invades a Caribbean island, Grenada, to overthrow a ruler there, which had links with the drugs cartels and things like that, which would have been fine had it not been for the fact that Grenada was part of the Commonwealth, and the British Queen Elizabeth II was actually Grenada's head of state, and the Americans don't actually inform the British in advance, and that does actually lead to for a brief moment anyway, it does lead to some kind of friction between between the Americans and the and the British. There were one or two other areas concerning trade disputes, the fact that American corporations in Europe were the Reagan administration tried to get American subsidiaries in Europe to be subject to American law, not European laws. So this idea of extraterritoriality, that also creates problems. So overall, yeah, as I say, there are strong transatlantic ties, but there were some underlying areas of concern as well. And as I say, the Cold War appears to enter a particularly dangerous period in the early 1980s. Okay, I think I will finish on that point. Next lecture, we'll move on and just talk a little bit about the end of the Cold War and German unification.